What's up everyone, welcome to this video. In this video we're going to build a very simple REST API, and what we're going to do is to experiment with user management using FastAPI and Firebase Authentication. We're going to be using the Python SDK for Firebase, and we're going to use Pyrebase as a wrapper to help us access the different methods that Firebase Authentication provides. I hope you enjoy this video, and let's look at what we are going to build. So right here we have the application that we're going to build. It's just a simple REST API with three endpoints. One is for creating a user account, and another one is for logging in, and the next one is for validating our token. Now let me explain how this works. The first endpoint is responsible for helping us to create an account with Firebase. So what we do is to provide an email as well as a password, and then we send these credentials over to Firebase. So let me go ahead and try it out right here. So having these credentials right here, we can execute. And now we shall see that we have an error because this account exists on our Firebase. So what basically happens is each time we create an account right here, what we are doing is to create an account with Firebase's user management database. And once that is done, then we are going to return the ID of that specific user who has been created. So let us try creating a user who is not in our database. So what I'm going to do is to remove this specific user. So let's say 1234@gmail.com. If you go ahead and execute, I'm now going to see that the account will be created successfully for that specific user. We even see that their UID is being returned from Firebase, which is good. Now, having successfully created a user with this username or with this email, we can go ahead and log in with this. So I'm going to copy this email right here, and I'm going to close this. So when you go to our login part right here, and we provide this email, so I provide my email right here. So if I basically go to try it out and then provide the email that we created the account for, if we try to log in, we shall now see that we are being given a JWT or a JSON Web Token. So this token is going to help us to access protected endpoints that are going to be within our application. So we can copy this, and when we copy this JWT, we can then go ahead and verify if this token is valid. So that's how we can be able to get access to all the protected resources on our application if you are basically choosing Firebase. So what I'll do is to go ahead and clear this, and I'll basically close this. So we have one other endpoint which is for validating our token. So when validating this token or when using this token in any application, what we need to do is to provide this in every request, but we need to pass it through an authorization header. And this is the most secure way in which you can basically validate every request that you are trying to carry out, because then we cannot just send this token in the request body or in any other way, but we need to pass it in our headers and then send this to our server, which will then help us to check if it's valid and then allow us access to whatever I want to access. So when you go to our code, I basically did not include it in here because what we want to do is to include that token within our authorization header. So what we did is to write a simple script right here. So I'm going to pull up this code that it's running on. And this code is basically having the token. So I'm going to remove the token that we have right here and replace it with the token we've just created. So what I'll do is to just go ahead and remove it. So I'll go ahead and get rid of what we have as a token right here. And then I'll just simply provide our new token. So I'll go ahead and save. So what shall happen is that when you have this token, we are going to go ahead and basically carry out a request by using the request library. So what happens is in that request, we provide headers, but then the authorization header for that specific request is going to contain our token, just like you see right here. So if you make a post request to that specific endpoint, which is our ping endpoint, we go ahead and return the text, but that text is going to simply contain the ID of that specific user. So if I pull up my terminal and then I go ahead and run our python test.py, we now see that it's going to return the same ID as that of the user who we created when creating our user account. So I hope you learned something about how to use Firebase with FastAPI, and without further ado, let us get started building this. Before we get started, I'd like to show you what we're going to be using. So we're going to be using FastAPI to help us build the REST API, but we're going to be using Firebase-admin Python SDK, as well as Python Rebase, which is basically a simple wrapper for the Firebase API. So what it does is to give us easy access to most of the functions that are within the Firebase SDK, most of what we have here, but in a very much more easier way. So without any further ado, let us get started coding this simple application. So right here in my VS Code, what I'm going to do at first is to create a virtual environment which is going to hold the dependencies for this project. So I'm going to be using pipenv, but you can feel free to use virtualenv or any other tool that you may want. So the first thing I'll do is to go right in our folder. So this is a blank folder I've opened up in VS Code. And I'm going to start by creating a virtual environment with pipenv and then pipenv shell. So this will go ahead and basically create a new virtual environment within here. So right now we see that our shell has already been activated and a new shell will not be activated. I don't know why it doesn't show that it's activated, but let me close this. So what I'm going to do is to go ahead and basically open up the terminal once again. So if I say pip env shell, so this will go ahead and create our pip file as well as our virtual environment for this project. So we now see that our virtual environment is going to be created and our pip file will be created in here. So the first thing I have to do is to go ahead and first of all install FastAPI and UVCon. FastAPI is the framework that's going to allow us to build our REST API, and UVCon will allow us to run our FastAPI server via the ASGI, or what we call the asynchronous gateway interface. So to start, we are going to start with pip env install, and in this case we're going to install FastAPI and also going to install our UVCon. So once this is done, it's going to go ahead and install our dependencies, and it will also include a pipfile.log within our folder right here. So this will take some time depending on how speedy your network is. So once this is done, then the next thing I'm going to do is to create our main.py file, which is basically going to be the main file that's going to contain all our project source code. So what I'm going to do is to come right here and create a new file. I'll call this main.py. And once I've created this file, then we're going to go ahead and set up our FastAPI server. So I'll go right within our browser and close what we had for our demo. And what we shall have are the two websites, which is basically the documentation as well as our Pyrebase right here. So the first thing I'll have to do is to begin by creating what is called a FastAPI instance. Now this is where our app is going to run. So to begin, we're going to first import the FastAPI class. So we shall say from FastAPI, we are going to import our FastAPI class, and then we shall create our app instance. So this is going to be equal to FastAPI, and then in here we can provide some details. So we start by providing a description. So we shall say this is a simple app. So this will be a simple app to show FireBase authentication. So basically call it whatever you want. So I'll say FireBase Auth with FastAPI. And once I've been able to do this, then the next thing will be to provide a title. So we can basically provide our title right here, and we can basically call this Firebase Auth. And once we've been able to do that, then I'm going to create the 3 routes that we had in our demo. So I'm going to begin by setting up the route for our sign up. So I'll come and say app.post, and this is going to be for our sign up. So I'll create the endpoint and call it our sign up, and then I'll also have our handler for that specific request. So this is going to be for create for creating a user account. So we can basically call this create an account. So just come right here and call it create an account. Now I'll pass this for now. It's actually going to be async def, which is a function, and we shall pass this for now. I'll do the same thing for our login route. So I'll say app.post, and in this case what I have is the /login route, and this is going to have an async function as well. So I'll come and say async def, and this will be the one for login, or we can even make it have a clearer name such as create access token. So this will be access token, and in here we shall also go ahead and pass this. Now the next one we're going to have is going to be the one for, so I'll just come and say app.post, and then we shall have that as the one for validating our token. So we can basically call it ping, or let's call it ping just like we did for our demo. Then we shall have async def, and in this case we are basically going to call this validate token, so just like we had it on our Swagger UI. So this is going to be our validate token endpoint. So once you have these endpoints right here, the next thing we're going to do is to go ahead and basically make our server run. Now remember, we installed UVCon as the way to run our API, so we're going to go ahead and set up UVCon to run our FastAPI instance. So we go at the top right here, and the first thing we shall do is to import UVCon. So I'm going to go ahead and import our UVCon, and once I've imported UVCon, I'll come at the bottom right here and say if Danda name is going to be equal to Danda main, then what we're going to do is to use UVCon to run our application. Now the way we're going to do this is provide our FastAPI instance by locating where it is. So in this case, if our main.py file has the name main, then the module will be main, and we have to specify what we call our FastAPI instance, which is app. So I'll come and include it right here. So once that is done, then the next thing for us is going to be to run our server. Now if you notice, we are actually having our project running within our virtual environment, which is basically found at this location. So if we go ahead and pull up our terminal, the next thing we shall do is to run our server with Python main.py, and this is going to start our server at localhost 8000. So what I'm going to do is to go ahead and check this out. So I'll click, and this will open up in our Chrome. So we basically have not found on our root URL. But if you want to make this a little bit more interesting, what you can do is to put our docs URL or the Swagger URL on our root URL. So what I'm going to do is to add one extra argument here, which is going to be our docs URL, and this is going to be on our home page. So when I save and go back to this side, we are now going to see that no change is going to happen on our server. So what I'll do is to go ahead and add one specific argument to this method, and this is going to be our reload equals to true. Now the reason that's why I'm saying reload equals true is so that every time we carry out a change in our server code, we're going to have our FastAPI reloading, which is going to make it easy for us to see our changes. So if I stop our server and run it once again, we're now going to notice that it's going to reload every time we make a change, just like you see right here. So if we go back to our root URL right here and refresh, we're now going to see that our Swagger UI will be shown right here. Alright, so the internet had messed up a little bit, but now the UI is showing up just like you see right here. So now that you have our Swagger UI right here, we can see that we have our sign up endpoint, we have our login endpoint, and then we have our ping endpoint, or the one for validating our token. Now the next thing we're going to do is to set up our Firebase credentials. So the first thing we're going to do is to head over to Firebase. So I'm going to go to Firebase, I'll look for Firebase, and head over to the Firebase console, and in the console, the first thing we shall do is to basically set up a project and then an app, and with that app we shall set up our authentication. So have a variety of projects right here, but what you can do is to create another app. So what I'm going to do is to call this FastAPI, and then in here what you can do is to call it Auth. Then I'll just basically go ahead and press continue. So when we have pressed continue, then we shall basically enable Google Analytics. We shall basically set up an account. I have some accounts that are created, and right after that, then we are basically going to have our project being created. So once our project has been created, we shall press continue, and this will lead us to the project itself. So right in the project, Firebase gives us access to very many different functionality. We have authentication, the cloud store, we have analytics, we have performance and all that stuff. But what we need for now is going to be our authentication. So we shall head over to the authentication right here. I'm just going to click on authentication. And this will lead us to the authentication tab right here. So we're going to be shown a lot of information right here, but we shall go to the get started button and click that. And then we shall be shown the different types of authentication that we may want to do with Firebase. So since we were interested in email password authentication, that's exactly what you're going to tap on, but you can choose any other providers. And once you have that, then you're going to click enable. And then after enabling that, so there are two types of email password logins, which are email password as well as email link. But in this case, what we're going to do is to use email password signups and logins. So what we shall do is to go ahead and save. And once we've saved, then we've been able to enable that type of authentication for our specific app. And once we've been able to do that, then the next thing for us is going to be to get credentials that are going to allow us to access our Firebase by use of a Firebase-admin. So the way we're going to do that is to head over to the project settings. So we're going to go to the project settings, and inside the project settings we are going to go to our service accounts, and within our service accounts we are going to go ahead and get what is the service account credential. So the service account credential is what shall help us to basically authenticate or initialize our access with Firebase. So right here we see that it provides for us access by using other programming languages like JavaScript, Java, and for us we are using Python. So I'll click on Python, and what we shall do is to go ahead and copy the code that we have right here. So the code that we have here is basically going to help us to initialize a new Firebase app within our project. So what I'll do is to go ahead to our main.py right here, and then I'll basically paste in the code that we've got from Firebase. So I'll basically paste it right here. Another thing we can notice is we are being shown that these are not resolved because we have not yet installed Firebase-admin. So I'm going to install both Firebase-admin and Pyrebase at this point. So what I have to do is to open up our terminal, and then I'll go ahead and create a new terminal. So it's basically going to activate the virtual environment. Now it shows up right here, which is good. So I'll go ahead and use pip-env to install both Rebase and Firebase-admin. So I'll say pip-env install, and this will be Firebase-admin. So this is going to be Firebase-admin as well as our Pyrebase. But in case you are installing the latest version, which is Pyrebase 4, then you have to add the 4 at the end. So when you install our Firebase-admin as well as our Pyrebase, then those will be added to our project, just like you see right here. Now that as that is being installed, let's go ahead and also acquire our service account private key. So for us to get that, then we'll have to go back to our Firebase right here, and then we click on this button for getting a new private key. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that. So we are being told that access to the private key will give access to our Firebase services, but since we are using it for our project, then we can basically go ahead and generate it. So after generating this key, I'm just going to go ahead and show it in the folder I downloaded it, which is basically the one here. I can rename it to Firebase Auth. Let me actually just call it FastAPI Auth, or I can basically give it a name like service account.json. So what I'll have to do is to go ahead and grab it, and then I'll place it in the folder where our project is. So I'm going to copy it right here. So this file is going to contain the private key that will basically give us access to our Firebase services. And once I've been able to do that, then we now see that our dependencies are still installing. I don't know why that is taking some time, but once it's done, then we're going to go ahead and also basically change what we have in here. So what I'm going to do is to change our credentials so that they basically go ahead and match the path where our service account.json file is. So what I'm going to do is to actually name this service account. So I'll copy this name and rename it. Just for clarity, I'll just go ahead and put the name of that, which is service account key.json. And once I've been able to do that, then I'll basically get rid of this path, so that we basically have our access to our service account key.json. Now, seems like my dependencies have been installed. I don't know if I'm still within the same virtual environment. Let me check. I think I'm within the right virtual environment right here. So I'll just wait for it to get installed. And now we can see that when we get our service account key JSON file, all we have to do is to go ahead and initialize our app. So now that it's installed, you see that these have been got and they have been resolved by the Python extension for VS Code. So once this is done, then the next thing is going to be for us to set this up. Now, one thing that we need to basically notice is we are having this within our project code, and it's going to go ahead and initialize our app even when it's already initialized. So we're going to add some code to make sure this is only running in case we do not have any apps, or in case Firebase has not yet initialized an app. So the way we're going to do that is by coming right here and saying if not, then we need to check if Firebase apps have been installed. So in this case, shall say if not Firebase-admin dot underscore apps. So this is basically us checking if we haven't yet initialized any apps with our Firebase-admin. Then what we shall have to do is to go ahead and initialize this right here. And another thing that we're going to do is to go ahead and basically get access to Firebase by using our rebase. So the way we're going to do that is by basically coming right here. We shall create a Firebase instance, and this is going to be equal to, so we are going to import our Pyrebase. So the way we're going to do that is by basically coming right here and saying import Pyrebase. So in this case, we shall just basically say Pyrebase. So I'll just come right here after initializing our app and then create a new first Firebase instance. Now this Firebase instance is going to be equal to Pyrebase dot, in this case, shall initialize our app. But what we need here is the Firebase config. So the Firebase config is going to be the one to allow us to access Firebase by basically specializing what kind of application that we are building. So for us to access that, then we shall have to go back to our Firebase console. So if I go back to our Firebase console right here, what I'll do is to go right where I have our general settings, and then I'll go ahead and basically create a new app. So when you go right here, I'll basically add a new web app, and this web app is going to be our FastAPI Auth. So we can set up Firebase hosting, but I'm not going to set it up. So I'll just come and register right here. And once this is registered, then we shall be shown how we can include it within our app. So since we have basically used our Firebase Auth, we have been shown an example for Node.js, but what we require is actually one for basically where we use our Python. So in case you want to basically change this, all we need is this specific dictionary right here, but I'm going to just continue to the console. And within our console, I'm going to go where we have our config. So we have the SDK setup and configuration. And what I'll do is to go ahead and click on config. So what I'll do is to just copy what we have here. And then I'll go within our code. So I'm just going to basically paste what we have right here. And this is JavaScript, so I'll have to change this to Python. So what I'll do is to call this our Firebase config. And this is going to be equal to a dictionary containing all this data. So at the time of recording this, I've already deleted whatever we have here, so you won't be able to use it. So what I have to do is to basically make this a valid Python dictionary. So I'm going to do this. So once I've been able to do that, then I'm going to remove the semicolon right here, and now we have our Firebase config right here. So once we've basically got this Firebase config, then you'll have to put it within our Firebase setup right here. So I'll go right here, and what I have to do is to basically provide our Firebase config, and this will be just enough for us to set up our Firebase. So hoping that our server is still running at this time. So just going to go back here. So we see that we have a key error, and this is basically coming from Pyrebase. This is telling us that we should have the database URL set up within our credentials or within our config. So since we're not going to use the real-time database that comes from Firebase, then what we shall have to do is to just simply copy this key and add it to our config that we've just set up right here. So what I'll do is to come right here and basically paste in that name, and then we shall have to provide just provide a blank string for now. And now that we've done that, we shall see that our server is going to be running. So now that we've set up Firebase successfully and everything is working, the next thing we're going to do is to go ahead and set up our sign up functionality. So for us to set up our sign up, we are going to go ahead and create Pydantic models that are going to be the ways through which our API will receive data from the end user. These are going to be all what we need for our login as well as our sign up. Now if we want to use this within our main.py file, I'll go back to main.py. I'll have to just first import this. So I'll say from models, I'm going to go ahead and import our login schema as well as our sign up schema. Now that you've been able to do that, then the next thing is going to be for us to use them within our routes. So I'm going to begin with our sign up schema. So I'll have to basically provide an argument here, which is basically going to be our user data. And this is basically going to use type hinting to basically say that whatever user data that we're going to get is going to be of the type user sign up schema, or what we call our sign up schema. So this will give us access to both the email as well as the username of the user. And another thing we shall do is to go ahead and do that for our login. So I'll come and say that this will be our user data and this will be our login schema. So once we've been able to do that, if we go ahead and look at our API right here, or our documentation, if you refresh, we are now going to see that this will expect the email and the password. So we have an extra attribute that's being added to our documentation, which is a request body. So one way we can customize it to make it basically show an example of the data that we expect is by adding a config class to our models. So to do that, we're going to go back to our models right here, and what we shall have to do is to add a class inside our class, but that is going to be the config class. And inside our config class, then we are going to go ahead and basically define an attribute called the schema extra. And what this is going to do is to allow us to basically define how we expect the request body to be. Now in this case, shall set the key of example, and we shall basically provide some data of the example data that we need. So in this case, we are going to provide our email, and let's say we shall have sample at, let's say, gmail.com, and then we can also have our password here. So this can be password, and our password can be our sample pass 123. So once we've been able to do that, if we go back to our schema or our documentation right here, if we refresh, we shall now see that our body is going to have that specific data that we specified, which is good. So the next thing we're going to do is to do the same thing for our login. So we shall just basically come and copy what we have here, because there's no difference between the two schemas. So I'll just come and provide the class even in our login schema. So once we've been able to do this, then our login endpoint will also change on our UI, so we shall also have that right here. Now, since we've been able to deal with pretty much what we need on the API, then let's go ahead and deal with the real functionality of these API endpoints. Now, this is where Pyrebase and our Firebase-admin SDK is going to come in. So the first thing we shall have to do is to deal with signing up of our users. So the sign up flow works in the following way. When we sign up, what we do is to provide our user data and then store it in a database. So what Firebase is going to do is to create a unique ID for each user that we're going to create with our application. And once this is done, then we can not be able to create that specific user, or that user will have an email that's going to be unique to only them. So for us to achieve that, what I'm going to do is to go ahead and access our email. So we're going to start with our sign up endpoint. Shall access our email. So our email is going to be coming from our user sign up schema right here. So we're going to say user.email. Actually, it's going to be our user data. So shall say user data.email. And once we've been able to access that, we shall also access our password, and this is going to be equal to our user data.password. Now, after doing this, then the next thing for us is going to be to create our user basing on these credentials. Now, we're going to try and accept, because we expect to run into errors such as the one that basically the one that we're supposed to face in case we create a user account of a user who is existing because their email is already used. So for us to achieve that, then we're going to make use of FastAPI's exception handlers. Actually, we're going to make use of FastAPI exception classes to help us achieve that. So what I'm going to do is to write a simple try except block. So inside here, we're going to create a user, and if all fails, then we shall basically accept, and we shall accept and basically return the error right here. So I'm going to begin by trying to create a user. So the way we create a user is by basically creating a user object, and this is going to be one that's going to come from our Firebase-admin. So Firebase-admin is going to allow us to create a user by accessing a method, and this will take in the email and the password and allow us to create a user. So for us to access that, then what we shall have to do is to import our Auth package, and this is basically give us access to our Firebase Auth. So that is the Firebase Authentication package. So inside the authentication package, we'll get access to all the methods that are going to help us to be able to create users and manage our users. So what I'll do is to come right here and say auth.create, and this is basically going to be create user. And in here, we're going to expect that we're going to have our email as well as our password. So what I'll do is to come here and provide our email. So I'll say email is going to be equal to email, and our password will basically be our password. So once this is done, this is going to basically go ahead and create our user. And after successful creation of a user, what you may want to do is to go ahead and assure the client or any app that's going to make use of our API that we've successfully created our user. So we're going to return a response. Now to return a response, I'm going to be using FastAPI's JSON response to do that. So I'll have to import it here by saying from FastAPI dot responses, we are going to go ahead and import our JSON response. And once we have that, then we're going to go ahead and basically return our JSON response that's going to basically show the status code as well as the detail of the success of this specific operation. So we shall come and say return, and this is going to be our JSON response. In here, we're going to provide our content, and this content is going to basically be our message. So when I come down here, we are going to have our message, and this message is going to be one for user account created successfully. So let me make this a little bit small so that you guys can see. So in here, we're going to say user account created successfully for user, and then we shall provide the user here. So we are going to get access to the unique ID of that specific user who created the account. So right in here, if you want to access that, then we shall come and say user.uid. So that will give us access to the user's ID. Now in our accept block right here, what we're going to do is to accept the specific errors that we may get in case this user is actually created. Now one of the common errors that is common when creating a user account is to force the creation of a duplicate account, or one for which an email already exists. So for us to basically accept that, then what we're going to do is to go ahead and accept that specific error by accessing auth.email exists. So we have access to the different errors, and this is going to be the email already exists error. And in here, we are supposed to raise an exception. Now we're going to make use of FastAPI's HTTP exception class to do exactly that. One important thing that we've forgotten to add here is that after the successful creation of a user account, we may also need to provide the suitable status code. And to do that, I'm going to come and provide the comma and also add the status code right here. And this is going to be our 201 status code. So when I do that, I'm going to save. So let's go back to where we were. So once I've been able to do this, hoping that our server is running, we see that we need to write some code inside our accept block. So I'm going to begin by importing FastAPI HTTP exception class. So I'll come and say from FastAPI dot exceptions, we are going to go ahead and import our HTTP exception. And once we've been able to do that, then we're going to come right here, and what we shall have to do is to come and say raise, and this is going to raise our HTTP exception. So in here, we're going to first of all need the status code. So in this case, our status code is going to be the 400 status code, or one for showing a bad error in case we basically messed up while making a request on our front end. So once we've done that, then we are going to go ahead and also provide our detail. So in this case, we shall basically say that account already created for the email, and then we shall provide our email. So we can say that we're going to have our email right here. So let me convert this to an F string so that we can actually have our email showing up in that string. All right, so now that this is done, let us go ahead and test our endpoint. So I'm going to go back to our UI right here, and what I have to do is to create an account. So we already have some sample data right here, and our database is empty. So I just basically go ahead and try it out. So when I execute, we now see that it's going to make the request, and now we see that our account has been created successfully for our user with this specific new ID or unique ID. So this will basically create the account for the sample user that we have right here. In case we try to execute this once again, we are now going to see that we are going to have an error, and this error is going to be one that's showing us that an account already exists for the sample email that we've been able to use. So let's go ahead and create a new user account. So what I'll do is to basically add 123 to this to make it sample 123, but you can use a valid email. So when I execute, we're now going to see that a new user account has been created for the user, and this is going to be the specific unique ID for that specific user. So now our sign up functionality is working correctly. So what I'm going to do is to go ahead and now deal with our access token, or the one that helps us to create our access token. So the way we're going to do that is by going back to our code right here. We're going to follow the same steps. So for us to create our login, we're going to go ahead and access our email as well as our password. So I'm just going to come and copy this since we have something similar for the login schema. So I'm just going to come and copy this, and once I've copied that, then we're going to also do the same thing. So we're going to try, and in this case what we need to do is to basically go ahead and access our token. So the way we're going to access our token is by using our Auth, our Firebase Auth module to access that specific method for logging in with a username and a password, or an email and a password in this case. So what we're going to do that is by saying our user is going to be equal to, so in this case we shall basically access auth dot, so in this case we're going to access auth dot sign in. It's actually going to be our PB object, or our Python-based object right here. Sorry for that. So in here what we're going to do is to come and say Firebase, which is our Python-based object, and in this case we shall access dot, so this is basically going to be our sign up with username and password, or what we can do is to actually go ahead and access this. So this is what we are trying to access. So we're going to try to access the specific method by its name. So I'll go right here and try to find it out. So this is actually for initializing. So the method is actually sign in with email and password, just like you see right here. So after creating our instance right here, which is firebase.auth, then we are going to go ahead and access that. So we are going to go ahead and say firebase.auth, and in this case we shall access our sign in. So this is actually going to be dot, and in this case shall sign in with our email and password. So we shall provide our email, and our email is going to be equal to our email, and then we shall also have our password right here. So our password is going to be equal to our password. So once I've been able to do this, then we need to also access the token of the user who has logged in at this point. So for us to be able to do that, we are going to create a variable called our token, and this is going to be equal to user. So this user will basically have that token right here. So then we shall access that is by basically accessing the ID token. So basically the user will have a lot of attributes, including the token, which is basically the ID token right here. So for us to access that, we shall say ID token, and this will basically be the access token, or the JWT, that will help us to access other parts of the application. So for us to return this in a response, we shall just come and say return JSON response, and in this case we're going to come and say that our content for this response is going to be equal to a dictionary, and this is going to have a message. So the message in here is going to be our JWT. So we can basically change this from our token. Let's actually just say that we're returning our token, and our token is going to be our token right here. So once we've been able to provide our token, then we have to also provide a status code, and this status code is going to be the 200 status code for an OK sign in. So Now let's go ahead and deal with our except block. We are going to catch any errors that may exist when we are trying to sign in. So what we're going to do is to go ahead and accept, and right here what we're going to do actually is to go ahead and return or raise an HTTP exception. So we shall come and say raise HTTP exception, and this case shall set our status code to be our 400 status code, and then we shall also set our detail to, let's say, invalid credentials. So we shall say that we're going to have our invalid credentials as the message, which can be invalid email or invalid password in this case. So let's go ahead and try to test this specific endpoint. So I'll go ahead and check if our server is running, which is running. So when you go back to our Swagger UI right here, we're going to access the one for creating an access token. So we already have this sample email and sample password already existing in our database. So we just hope that it works. So if I execute this right now, I'm now going to see an error. So let's go back and see right here. So I actually made a mistake. This was supposed to be data.password. So hoping that our server is running, shall go back to our UI right here and try to execute that once again. And now we're going to see that a JWT or a JSON Web Token is being created for us to access the application, just like you see right here. And this is very interesting right now. So the next thing we're going to do is to go ahead and verify or validate our token. So to validate our token, what we're going to do is to deal with this specific endpoint for basically validating our token. So let me clear this and close this so that we can basically check that out. Now this specific endpoint is going to be making use of our authorization header to get the token and verify it. So that means you don't have to basically implement its request body. So for us to do that, we're going to head over to our code, and within our code we are basically going to go ahead and validate it. So the first thing we shall have to do is to basically set up a way for us to set the request header or to get the request headers for this specific request. So the way we're going to do that is by using FastAPI's request object, and what that will help us do is to get access to the authorization header, which we shall later on go ahead and validate. So to do that, what I'm going to do is to go right here at the top of our code and import our FastAPI request class. So I'm going to come and say from FastAPI.requests, we're going to go ahead and import our request class. And after importing our request class, then we shall go at the bottom right here. And what we shall do is to basically pass that as a parameter within our request handler function. So I'm going to come and say that we shall have a request, and this is going to basically be of type request, which is our FastAPI request class. And then after doing this, then we need to access our headers. So our headers will be got from our requests. So this is going to be request.headers. And once we've been able to do that, then we need to get that specific authorization header. So then we're going to access our JWT. So in this case, we shall come and say that our JWT is going to be equal to what we shall get as our authorization header from our header. So in this case, we can say headers and then dot get, which will allow us to basically get our authorization header. So we shall have to just specify that that key is going to be authorization or our authorization header. And here is the interesting part where we actually need to verify our token ID. So the way we're going to do that is by coming and using our Auth module right here. So we shall access our verify ID token function right here. And what this is going to take in is the JWT or the token that we need to verify. So once we've been able to do this, then what you can do is to go ahead and say user is going to be equal to verify ID token, just like you see right here. So what this will do is to go ahead and check and verify the signature and data of the provided JWT. So what it will do is to basically return a dictionary of key value pairs passed from the decoded JWT. So that's what we shall basically get. So it will raise a value error if it's empty and all that stuff. But what we need is to basically get the user who this JWT belongs to. So we shall provide our JWT in here. And once we've been able to do that, then we are basically going to come and return our user ID. So we shall come and say that we shall access our user. And in this case, we are basically going to return the UID of that specific user who created this token. Now to test this endpoint, since we are going to be making use of auth headers, you can make use of a tool like Postman. But what I'm going to do is to set up a simple module that's going to have a function that will basically make a request to this endpoint and then include our token within our headers. So what I have to do is to go right here and create that file. So I'll just basically call it test.py, and in here what I have to do is to first of all import requests. So let's see if we have requests in here. So we do not have requests, so that means we have to install it. So I'll pull up my terminal and then basically go right here within our virtual environment and then install requests with pip env install and then requests. So what this is going to do is to install requests, the request library that will help us to make API calls to our API, while also giving us the ability to include things such as authorization header and whatever data that we may need to make those requests. So while this is happening, let's check if our server is running, which is good. So when we go back to our UI right here, we see that we have our access token that we basically got from our response. So let me try to execute once again. So we now see that we have our token. I'll just basically go ahead and copy it right here. When I copy it, I'll go within our test.py and then I'll create a string, which is basically going to be our token. So let me just paste our token right in here. So just come and paste our token right here. And then what I'm going to do is to define the function. So I'm just going to say test validate endpoint or test ping or whatever you have to call it. So this is going to be our test validate endpoint. And what it's going to do is to make a request to our API endpoint and then basically return the text response of that specific request. So now that our request has been installed, I'll go at the top right here and import requests. And once I've been able to do that, then we're going to create a response object right here. And this response object is going to be coming from requests dot, in this case we shall specify the API method. So this is going to be actually the HTTP method is going to be post, and then the URI or the URL in fact that we're going to make a request to is going to be our localhost 8000. So shall say HTTP, so you can write it as 127.0.0.1 and then we specify the port. So our API is running on port 8000 if you've been noticing. So when you go back here, when we see the port is 8000, so we shall also have to place 8000 right here, and then the URL is going to be our ping URL. So what we need here is to basically go ahead and provide our headers. So we're going to just come and say that our headers is going to be equal to a dictionary, and this is going to have the authorization key, and this will basically have our token. So once we've been able to do that, then we shall just come and provide our headers right here. So we shall just basically come and say that our headers is going to be equal to our headers, and that will be enough to create our response. Now in case we want to return our response in text form, what we shall have to do is to return our response, and we want to return our response as text. So this is just enough to make an API call to our API. So if we go right here and try to print this, so we shall say print, in this case shall come and test our validate endpoint. So the endpoint we're actually trying to validate is the one for basically validating if our token is valid. So if you go right here and try to run this, what we expect is we are going to make a request to our ping endpoint, and when you make a request to that endpoint, it's going to go with our authorization header, which will contain our token, and if our token is valid, then we are simply going to go ahead and return the ID of that user who created that specific token. So let's go ahead and test it. So when I pull up my terminal right here, I'm going to go within our terminal, and then I'll say Python test.py. So we now see that we are having an error right here. So let's go ahead and see what that is going to be. So we see that our object has no attribute UID. So let's see what object that is going to be. So if we try to basically provide to go to our main.py, we can actually say user. Let's just return the user and see what is going to be returned. So if we try to run our code right here, we're now going to see that this is going to return a user, and this user is basically going to have the following credentials. So let me actually try to dig into it and see what we're going to return. So what we have right here is basically going to be a dictionary, and it's going to contain all this information, but what we needed to access is basically going to be so let me just copy and paste it somewhere where I can actually see it well. So if we go and paste it, let me just paste it somewhere. So let me just paste it here in test.py. So if we go ahead and check this specific dictionary that has been returned, we now see that it basically contains a lot of information. But if you want to access the ID, then we'll access Firebase, then sign in provider, then we shall see that the UID is in here. So we need to access this. So let me try to format this, and let me actually just try to format the entire thing. So let me just try to get where I access the UID or return the UID. So this is actually going to be the user ID, which is actually the user ID. I don't know why I didn't get this. So let me try to change the code so that we actually get to see what is being returned. So these are all the details of the dictionary that we have. So we have it being the user ID, which is basically the same as what we have right here. So I'm just going to come and provide the user ID. So if we go in our main.py and then say that we're going to return user.user ID, we shall now go ahead and get rid of this dictionary right here. And then when you go ahead and try to run our test.py, we shall now see it seems like still have that internal server error. I don't know why it's happening. So dict object has no attribute user ID. So let me check it. So if we return user and then go ahead and try to check, so this is a dict item, dict object, and I think we're supposed to access this by the key. So I was actually saying user ID. So what if I try to access this with dot, or let's say user ID. So when I save and try to run this again, so if I try to run a server again, so our server is running. If I go to the terminal right here and try to access our test.py, we shall see that's going to return the text of our specific user ID, like the one you see right here. So basically what we've done is to go ahead and build a simple REST API that is going to use FireBase Authentication for basically signing up, logging in, or creating access tokens, and then validate those tokens by still use of Firebase. If you've enjoyed this video, please leave a like and don't forget to subscribe to my channel if you're new. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see more topics that you may want to see. Please leave a comment down in the description below. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye.